All right. So welcome. It's 7 o'clock. And so thank you to all of you who are super timely already. That's great. I still want to give people about 2 to 3 minutes. So if you're just getting in, think about, I wish my student would just. So what's the skill you wish your student would just? And we'll get started soon. All right, I'm noticing a couple people can't get in. I'm sorry. Just scooting back a second. So I've got a couple people trying to get in, so I'm just going to quickly stop and sign back in. All right. All right, so let's get started. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited to share this information with you. Welcome to my webinar. Just wanted to start with the purpose of this is to actually give you an introduction to teaching study skills. So this is about the process, not going to give you absolutely everything, every study skill, so just be aware. I hope by the end of this that you'll take away some understanding of this process and how that works. So if you didn't have a second to sort of focus yourself, think about the sentence, I wish my student would just, and fill in the blank. What is the thing that you wish your student would just? Good evening. Good evening, Tiffany. All right. So just to give you a little bit of background, welcome. This is who I am. So I'm Margaret Davis. I've been teaching for, this is my 12th year in classroom teaching, and I've taught many different subjects, science, math, and English. And what I learned from all of this is that if you don't teach the students the skills to really own that content and really understand it, it doesn't matter if you keep teaching. So I actually went back to get my school's counselor's license specifically to learn how to do that. I learned a lot about what are the feelings involved in learning. When you think about it, dealing with frustration is a big deal, and dealing with failure. And we don't often talk about that. So that's something I learned, which was really great. And how do you build those habits? Because it's really hard to change, especially as adults. I can only imagine as children, because I don't remember changing very much. So the third piece is for the past 4 years, I've been working as a learning specialist, and I have all my credentials as a teacher of someone with learning disabilities, and that really helped me figure out strategies that really make it accessible to everyone. So what's the point? So the point of all this is pretty much I use all those pieces to develop this program that really gives you a process of how to teach study skills and individualize it. And what I'm hoping from this webinar is to give this over to you and sort of communicate this process to you so that you can implement it in the best way possible. So this is only 30 minutes. Here's what we're talking about. So the first thing we're talking about, what do I mean when I say study skills? Why are they important? I'm gonna outline the process for you. I'm not gonna get into the nitty gritty of the different steps, but then I have next steps and supports for you. And if you're interested in more webinars, please fill out the survey at the end so I know and we can continue to do this. So, study skills. A big buzzword in education now, we hear executive functioning weaknesses all the time. I just want to be clear about what I mean in terms of study skills versus executive functioning. Executive functioning, for those of you who don't know, it's pretty much the skills you need to get stuff done. So pretty much study skills are the same thing as executive functioning. The reason I call it study skills is because I want to be clear that these are skills every student needs and every student can improve upon, not just the students with ADHD or students who have executive functioning weaknesses, which is why I give that broad definition of it. And when we talk about study skills, I love this picture because I feel like this describes exactly what we imagine it is. A kid at a desk just scribbling things and studying and somehow getting it in their brain. But actually it has a lot of components. So I've broken it down into 3 parts. There's the organization piece of study skills, there's the understanding piece, and then there's the production piece, like can they actually produce in assignments? So the organization piece, we always think of the materials, we think of the exploding backpack that we've seen, but actually it also includes information. If students can't find the information they need to get the stuff done, that's a problem. And that's something that's really important in life. Another part of organization is being able to organize your time. Planning is huge, especially making sure they can get things done in a week so that they're not stressed. And what's important about this piece is this is essential for life. Understanding is just making sure that the student understands the content. And before you can even do that, kids even struggle with the point of trying to identify what they know and what they don't know. We actually have to teach them how to identify that. Also how to study. And finally, let's say they have identified something that they don't understand. They have to be able to figure out some strategies to be able to understand, which is hard for them. And so when we're talking about producing, we're talking about things like writing. Another thing I've seen is you have those kids who study really hard for tests and know the information, but for some reason can't apply it on the test. It's what they're being asked, it's how it's phrased. There's so many skills involved with test taking that has more to do with executing tasks than it does knowing the information. And finally, following directions and checking your work carefully. So I just want to take a second right now, as we're talking about why study skills, if you guys can put in the chat, or if you're comfortable turning on your mic for a second, why do you think study skills are important? We can put it in the chat. Somebody can turn on their mic.
Hi.
Hey. So why do you think study skills are important, Betsy?
Well, luckily, and hopefully this won't be as much of an issue going forward, but as you're discussing this, Margaret, I'm just remembering what I saw last school year. And all of a sudden my middle schoolers were kind of turned loose and they didn't have me in the classroom hand holding them through certain like task completion things. And so all of a sudden I saw kids who I'd always, and you know, they're such bright students, but they didn't have that independence.
Yeah.
And that their ability to, like, they didn't have the ability to get the work done and like let their brightness shine, basically, because they were missing the study skills component.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. And actually, I'm going to address sort of the pandemic piece too, because I think that plays into this as well. So that's awesome. It helps build confidence that you know the material. Yeah. Solidify the information. So when you come across something challenging, you can rely on your knowledge. Yep, that's great. And so pretty much I'm just going to summarize what these things are. Pretty much study skills are what's important for life. Those time management, problem solving skills are what's going to help them do well in a career, in lifelong learning, and in school. So things like how to solve a problem, how to organize materials, we deal with that all the time as adults, and they're going to need it. And Betsy, going back to what you were saying about sort of the pandemic, one thing I want to point out is that last year was hard and we definitely saw some deficits in study skills. But the other thing, the flip side of that, is we also saw how independent students could be because they were forced to be. So one thing I challenge parents to do right now is think about what were the pandemic wins and improvements for your student. Now, I know we always think about all those assignments that didn't get done or all those things that didn't get done. And that's true. There were some things that students struggled with, but there were a lot of things students stepped up with as well and became independent and really learned some of those small study skills. So the reason I'm doing this seminar right now is because students are actually primed right now to learn these study skills. They had to learn a bunch of them and now they know they're important and now they're ready to actually use them in a way they hadn't been before. And one thing I suggest to parents is just take a second to go over with your student, what were those pandemic wins for them? What were those small skills that they got better at through the pandemic that they wouldn't have done otherwise? And that'll be a great way to start moving forward this semester, especially because this year is going to be super scary for a lot of students and a lot of parents. So getting into it. So here is the process of how to teach study skills. I've created this graphic. It's not really a cycle, so I'll explain how it works. So you start at the top, and the first thing you have to do is prioritize the skill to teach. We have a million things we want to teach students, but what is going to get the most bang for our buck? And what is small enough that they can be successful? So that before you even start, you got to start there. Second piece is we got to buy them in. We tell them what to do all the time, but we need to reinforce, why is it important to them? Why are they doing this extra work? Because believe me, they will tell us that it is extra work. Then you want to break it down into parts and steps, and then you want to practice with them. The planning piece is really important because they have to be able to do it on their own. They have to plan when they do it. And then the last step is you want to reflect and reassess based on where they are. So whatever they determine is the issue, you're going to go back to that step and correct it. So the purpose of this is not really a cycle. It's pretty much based on your reflection. You want to go back to whichever step is going to best address what their issue is. All right, so let's go through the steps one by one. I will stop for questions, so don't, and you can take notes if you want to. I also will give you this PowerPoint, so don't think you need to catch every piece of information because I'm going to end up giving you this PowerPoint. So step one we talked about is just prioritize the skill to teach. There are so many things we want them to learn, but these are some questions to guide you. So what gets in the way of their success? What skill will impact their success the most? So maybe they're struggling the most on tests and quizzes. That's where you want to start. You also want to think about where are they now with these skills? What strengths do they bring to the table? Because again, you want the first step to be something they can accomplish. So the goal of this is you want to create a win with a reasonable first step and choose the most important skill. So that's what prioritize is all about. The why. So I love this graphic because I think it describes me half the time with my students. I'm like telling them over and over and over again, and that's what it feels like to them, I'm sure. So one of the things that's super important is framing the why from their perspective. So why is this skill important to the student? How is it going to help them? And another thing I always ask students is like, what can they say to themselves when they don't want to do it? Because the truth is, a lot of these things are slightly annoying and hard, so they're not going to want to do it. So you need to help them come up with a phrase and a reason to keep going when it's annoying. So I also want to be clear that the goal of this step is to try it. I wish I could tell you that there's a magic thing you say and they're going to do it forever. But unfortunately, as we know, especially with teenagers, that's not how it works. So it's the consistency of the message and them seeing success that's really going to build the habit. And it's not to say you're not going to meet resistance, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So what I mean by resistance, and you've all seen this, you might not call it this, but it's when students avoid, they don't want to do things, and they argue with you about doing it. I don't need to. And we just know it's good for them. It's so frustrating. But we have to acknowledge that it's going to be there. And here's why. Changing habits is hard for even adults. It's definitely going to be hard for them. And so I just want to give you a little perspective about where they're coming from and why this resistance happens for them. First, the most common thing is they feel as though what you're asking them is extra work. I did my homework. Why are you asking me to do this? I'm sure somebody here has heard that already. The second piece is, especially if they struggle, they're afraid that even if they work hard, they're not going to succeed. What I've put in the corner, one of my favorite ADHD coaches, Brendan Mahan, talks about what's called the wall of awful. And it's pretty much the things you build up in your head that prevent you from doing something. And so I just want you to think about this image when you are teaching these things, that kids do have a wall. And so what I've put here are some examples of things they might be feeling. So I might try and fail. I can barely get my homework done now. How do you know it will work? Again, I wish I had a magic wand for you that I can give you that will take away all this, but the principles for dealing with this resistance are twofold. You want to keep your goal really simple and small and achievable for the student, and also take some time to address the emotions. We often don't talk about the fact that change is hard. We tell them what to do and we expect them to do it, but how to move through the hard and how we move through hard is a great way to start for them. All right. So before we move on, I want to see if there are any questions, comments just on those first two steps, because we're going to get to steps 3, 4, and 5 after this. So feel free to put in the chat. All right. Step number 3, here we come. So step number 3 is probably the hardest, where you have to break it down for them. And there are 2 pieces to this. First, you want to create the simplest steps of the skill. And so I'm going to give you an example of what I do. When I teach students how to study, I break it into 3 steps. First, you need to identify what will be on the test. If you don't identify that, they're not going to know what to study and they're going to study the wrong stuff. Second piece is you want to make sure that they understand. If they don't understand what they're learning, it doesn't matter how much they memorize because it's not going to stick. And the third step is the practice, which is pretty much just the memorization part. And that's what we're most familiar with studying, but the first 2 steps are really important too. Now, if I just taught a student this would be way too much for them at one time. Those are big steps. There's a lot going on. So what you have to do is choose an achievable chunk that you can start with. So what I've shown in the icon here is a strategy I use with students where I help make sure they understand. This is something they can actually do to make sure they understand. So this is a list of all topics that might be on an assessment. So you've identified that these are the topics for a math test. And this is actually one that I did with Trinity's class. So Tiffany, you'll recognize this. And basically you have to color code each of these things. So the colors stand for this. If it's red, they don't know it at all, and they really don't understand it. So that's where you're going to spend the most work. The green is, I've really got this. It's just a quick review. And then the yellow is, I sort of know it, but I need to practice it. And this way, they can identify what they know and what they don't know. And it's a tangible way to do that. So this is an example of how you might break it down for students. Generally, just keep it to 3 steps if you can. You can teach them more later, I swear. Think about like the actions or expectations in whatever the skill is. And if you want to, you can actually define the steps with them. And the more language they include into the steps, the more likely you're going to get the buy-in and the understanding that you want. So those are just some hints as you do this. All right. So practice is pretty self-explanatory. You want to show them. And this right here is an example of a weekly plan that I've done with a student. We basically took all the assignments and slotted them into different times and talked about, okay, does this feel overwhelming? Where can this go? Where can't this go? You can even say there's a no work day. That's really important. And you may have to practice many times. That's okay. We don't learn a skill just one time, so they won't either. The planning piece is really important because that's when they start to take ownership over this process. You want them to give you an example of when they'll use the skill, because if they don't know when they're going to use the skill, they're never going to use it on their own. And it's going to be this cycle of you're constantly telling them to do it. You want them to own it and do it when it's necessary. So think about these questions. In what situation will I use this skill again? What will I do? When will I do it? And this is key. How will I remind myself to do it? Because kids will forget and we'll forget. We remind ourselves all the time. So you want to put that accountability and piece in there about how they will remind themselves so that they're more a part of the process and they feel accountable to it. All right. Any questions? Oh, author of The Wall of Awful, Brendan Mahan. He has a podcast called ADHD Essentials. You should check it out. It's great on executive functioning. On to the reflection. This is where the learning happens. This is the meat and potatoes, the whole thing. Pretty much, we don't expect them to get it the first time, but we want them to have to think about why it didn't work, because that's where the change happens. We want them to learn to adapt and grow. We also have to teach them to identify what went wrong, because otherwise we see this cycle from students that I didn't get it, I'll do better next time. That has zero momentum for change right there, because they're not doing anything different. They're just going to pull up their bootstraps and do it. And we know that's not how that works. So these questions in the left-hand side are really essential to helping them. So did I complete my plan? Why or why not? What got in the way? What worked? How can I do better next time? I really like these questions because it's a way to hold kids accountable that isn't accusing. They know they didn't do what they were supposed to do. They feel it, whether you say it or not. But if you ask them questions, so what got in the way, you're not blaming them. You're trying to identify like where the pitfalls were so that you're creating change. You have to teach them to create change. And that's what this process is all about. And at the end is the reassess portion. So that tells you where to go back next time. You're never, well, it's not you're never going to be done with this, but it's not go through once and then you're done with teaching study skills. It's more of like a cycle. And especially the 4 and the 5, the practice and plan and the reflect and reassess, that's going to happen multiple times until they take ownership. So the reassess portion is pretty much how they identify the difficulty, which will help you decide what to do next. Now, I'd actually like to give you some examples of the most common things kids say in this process to help you use this graphic. So the first most common answer I get is, I didn't have time. Now, if they didn't have time, first you want to talk about how much time they actually have. Oftentimes they think they don't have time, but you're asking for a 10-minute task. That's not too much. So that's part of the discussion, but you also want to go back to the why. Yeah, you may feel like you don't have time, but why is this important? Why is it important to take that 10 minutes to do this? The reminder and the why is really going to reinforce that piece. You may not need to go back down to break it down again. You can go straight to practice and plan and reflect and reassess. I didn't have time. That's another common one. One, I would suggest going back to the planning for that one, because oh wait, we just said didn't have time. I'm sorry about that. Too much work. That's the next one. So too much work. Oftentimes students see this as too much work. They don't want to do extra work. If you can break it down into something that seems like an achievable chunk, so that's where you go back to the break it down, kids can start to see it's not actually a big deal. Maybe you start with 10 minutes. If you're working on a student keeping track of their assignments, instead of having them keep track of everyone, you start with one subject. You're doing one subject this week. I want to see it all written down. And that's reasonable. And they feel like they can do it, and they're much more likely to buy in. I forgot. That's the one I thought we were on. All right. I forgot to do it. That you would probably go back to the plan piece, because one of the things in the plan we talked about in the last slide was reminders. Having kids set reminders. Who's going to remind you? Who's going to hold you accountable? Are you going to set a timer on your phone? Do you need a person to remind you to do it? Helping kids see that everyone uses reminders, we as adults use reminders, will help them not forget. Where are you going to write it down? So that's where you want to go back to the planning piece. Another common answer you get here is, I didn't know what to do. So, sorry about that. If they don't know what to do, you probably want to go back to the break it down. Break it down and list the steps again, and then you're going to keep practicing. So here's some examples about how we go through this process and reassess and use this graphic. All right. I've just given you a lot of information. So what I'd really like you to do is just take a minute, write down anything, any understandings you have about the process, think about any questions you might have. And if you have any questions, put them in the chat. We're going to get to how I can support you in a second, but I just want to take a second to think. How would you use this to help with your student? What might be your priority? What was that thing you said at the beginning? What would that look like? Going to give us about 20 more seconds just to reflect a little bit. So, Mark, that's a really good question. Time management is really hard. And I would say there's no one tool that works. I think it's the consistency that helps with the time management of assignments. Have them keep doing it. And you can't take the wheels off until they're really doing it together with you or partially on their own. So I think what's tricky about the calendars is we keep thinking that one calendar is going to make the difference. It's not about the calendar, actually. It's about the consistency of the questions that you're asking. So whatever you do, make it a routine so that they know it so well that they can do it on their own. So Mark, does that help a little bit? Okay, awesome, great. Are there any other questions before I talk about how I can help you in the future? Great. Okay, so we're gonna wrap up in a second. Ways that I can support you moving forward. So here are the services that I offer. First is parent coaching. I meet with parents to give you specific tools based on what your child needs and the skill your child needs. So as you can see, study skills is huge. So I can't give you everything here, but I can, in one-on-one, I can tailor it towards your child. And I can also talk you through some difficulties. That can be a weekly or as needed basis. I also am going to be doing some future webinars with some resources and some details explaining each individual step. I'm going to give you a survey in a second. And if you're interested in future webinars, please click that on the survey so that I can reach out to you when those are happening. And I also love to tutor. So this is what I tutor right here. I love to work with students to figure out these skills and what works for them and get it to stick and get them to own it. That is the nature of this process and what I love to do. Finally, if you want to contact me, here's my email and then my phone number. I'm going to send you these slides, so you'll be able to click for my website to go there to learn more about what I do and what the services are. But now I just want to take a quick second. I'm going to escape this and I'm going to put the survey in the chat for you if I can. Here we go. Let me know if you can't see it because I would like to know. Yep. Okay. So I put it in the chat. If you can take a quick second to just fill it out with what you'd be interested in the future, any questions, things you learned, that would be super helpful. I'm here. I love doing this stuff, as you can tell. This is sort of my passion project. So if you ever want to reach out to me about questions about any of this, feel free. Again, I'll send you the slides tomorrow if I have your email. And especially if you fill out the survey, I'll definitely have your email. So thank you so much for participating in this webinar. If you want to stay for a couple minutes and ask individual questions, feel free. I hope you learned about the process of teaching study skills, and one day you're as excited as me about it. And thanks again for participating and going through this journey with me. Take care. Oh, I'm glad it's helpful. Yeah, and if any of you want to stay on, we can chat if you have a specific question. Otherwise, please do the survey. I'd love to hear what you think. You're welcome. Thank you for the comments. I appreciate it. I like the thumbs up. All right. All right. Well, if there are no individual questions, I hope you filled out the survey. I'm going to close the meet. Thank you so much. Have a good night.